I didn't start this research trying to reconstruct a civilization that supposedly never existed. That wasn't the goal. But when you spend enough time studying the physical remains of the 19th century, the architecture that still stands, the industrial artifacts preserved in museums, the photographs taken between the 1840s and the early 1900s, you start noticing something strange. Not just what's present, but what's missing. You begin to notice the absence of explanation, the gaps in the historical record. And eventually you arrive at a realization that is difficult to ignore. The story we've been told about every day. Life in the 1800s doesn't fully match the physical evidence that still exists today. Not the buildings that remain, not the infrastructure buried beneath modern cities, and not the photographs that show a world that appears far more sophisticated than the one described in traditional history books. So, I began asking a different question. Not whether Tartaria existed, but what daily life might have looked like inside the civilization that left behind these structures. This investigation is about that question. What did life actually look like during a period we're told was primitive, pre-industrial, and technologically limited? According to the official narrative, most people lived modest lives. Transportation depended on horses. Communication moved slowly through handwritten letters. Construction relied on simple tools and basic craftsmanship. But when you examine what physically remains from that era, the roads that appear almost perfectly graded, the canals engineered with remarkable precision, the buildings constructed with mathematical accuracy, a different picture begins to emerge. Not a world of primitive struggle, but one of organized systems. Not isolation, but connection. Not simplicity, but coordination. Systems that today we struggle to fully understand, so the question becomes unavoidable. What was daily life actually like in this forgotten world? What did people do each day? How did they move through their cities? How did they work, trade, and live inside structures that appear designed for purposes we no longer recognize? The official narrative begins to collapse the moment you ask these questions. Imagine waking up in a 19th century city, often associated with what some researchers call the Tartarian world. Not in a romanticized historical fantasy, but inside the real buildings that still exist today. Apartment buildings with impossibly high ceilings, 12 feet, 14 feet, sometimes even 16 feet tall, far beyond what would be considered practical for heating in a cold climate. The windows stretch from near the floor to the ceiling, too tall to be purely decorative, too large to be accidental. They appear designed for something else entirely. Light distribution, air circulation, perhaps even pressure regulation within the building. Morning sunlight pours through those windows at carefully calculated angles. The placement isn't random. Many of these buildings are oriented in ways that align precisely with seasonal solar movement. The architecture interacts with natural forces, sunlight, wind flow, and water movement, in ways that modern buildings rarely attempt. You wake in a room surrounded by decorative plasterwork so intricate that modern craftsmen would require months to reproduce it. Crown molding flows along the ceiling like frozen water. Geometric patterns repeat across thousands of buildings in cities scattered across multiple continents. And yet we're told these buildings were designed by individual contractors working independently, all somehow arriving at the same architectural solutions. Ask yourself a simple question. How does that happen? Outside, the city begins to move. You step into clothing similar to what appears in surviving photographs from the period. Layered garments, structured coats, tailored fabrics. These weren't crude homespun materials. Many show evidence of industrial-scale textile production. Cotton grown in India, silk woven in Asia, wool imported from Australia. Yet these fabrics appeared regularly in provincial towns thousands of miles from where they were produced. They arrived consistently, predictably, as if moving through distribution networks far more sophisticated than horse-drawn wagons alone could support. Which raises another question. What infrastructure made this possible? When you step outside onto the street, the mysteries only deepen. These weren't dirt paths, and they weren't randomly placed cobblestones. Many streets were precisely graded thoroughfares built with drainage systems so effective that some still function today, more than a century later. Storm drains connected to underground networks stretching for miles, sewer systems designed with engineering principles that rival modern urban planning, water distribution systems capable of delivering pressurized flow throughout entire districts. And according to the official timeline, many of these systems appeared within only a few decades, across cities around the world, following the same basic engineering principles. Even the layout of the streets raises questions. Many are far wider than necessary for horse-drawn carts. In city after city, the streets align closely with the cardinal directions. Major boulevards radiate outward from central points in geometric patterns. From ground level, they appear ordinary, but from above, the pattern becomes unmistakable. Star-shaped city designs, radial layouts, precise geometry that suggests large-scale planning that official history tells us rarely existed at the time. And then there is the traffic itself. Photographs from the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s show streets filled with movement, but not the chaotic congestion we often imagine when we think of the 19th century. Instead, there appears to be organized flow, streetcars moving along rails, cable-driven transport systems, horse-drawn omnibuses operating along fixed routes, carriages moving through predictable lanes. The deeper I looked, the more evidence I found of transportation networks that seemed to have appeared fully formed. Street railways existed in hundreds of cities by the late 19th century. Cable car systems required underground machinery and complex mechanical infrastructure. Elevated railways appeared in major urban centers, and many of these systems emerged almost simultaneously. Each one required advanced surveying techniques, engineering expertise, organizational capacity, large financial investment. So the question remains, who coordinated all of this? Who designed the systems? Who possessed the mathematical knowledge and planning ability necessary to implement similar networks across entire continents? When you search the historical record for clear answers, the silence becomes difficult to ignore. And the streets were only one part of the system. The buildings, the utilities, the roads, the bridges, the canals, the mechanical systems, they all point to a level of planning and execution that official history struggles to account for. Entire cities appear to have been built with a vision that transcends the typical explanations of the period. The evidence suggests a society capable of organization, coordination, and technical skill on a scale that modern historians often overlook or dismiss. If the streets, buildings, and transport networks were products of such planning, then the daily life of the people who lived in these cities must have been shaped by these systems. They moved efficiently. They lived in environments that controlled light, air, and perhaps even temperature in ways we rarely consider. They worked in spaces designed for functionality, yet adorned with artistry. They traded, communicated, and traveled in ways that suggest a sophistication lost to time. The official narrative would have us believe this complexity emerged spontaneously, that these feats were the product of ordinary individuals acting independently yet consistently across continents. But when you follow the physical evidence, a different story begins to emerge, one in which order, design, and coordination were not anomalies but central to everyday life. So, ultimately, the question is no longer whether Tartaria existed, but how humanity once organized itself into systems so advanced that the traces still puzzle us today. What daily routines did people follow? How did they interact with their environment, their cities, their technology? What knowledge guided the construction of streets, the orientation of buildings, the distribution of goods, the flow of traffic? Each answer we attempt leads to more questions, and each unanswered question draws us deeper into a world that, by design or circumstance, has been obscured from conventional history. It's a world that challenges the assumptions we carry about the 1800s. A world that asks us to reconsider what daily life might have truly looked like when civilization moved, in ways both visible and hidden. What we find is not primitive struggle but sophisticated coordination, not isolation but connectivity across continents, not simplicity but complexity expressed in stone, metal, and movement. And it is here, in the interplay of buildings, infrastructure, and daily life, that the true mystery of this era emerges. A puzzle that continues to fascinate, confound, and inspire those willing to look beyond the accepted story.